This week, we're going to be talking about many modes of intervention, but one of the ones that I wanted to cover in terms of my lecture this week is related to the strengths-based intervention. This should not be an unfamiliar idea to you, but I want to go into more depth about actually utilizing the strengths-based perspective and also discussing some of the myths related to the strengths-based perspective in terms of intervention with families and individuals. So the strengths-based perspective offers a focused and committed effort for identifying, expanding, and sustaining the resilience and assets that client systems bring to their interface with the world. It's been kind of discussed as a very positive way of viewing people, an empowering way of viewing people, and operating and intervening with people. The strengths-based approach views supporting the client as central to the social worker's action. The two major principles of strengths-based approach as they apply to intervention are that the social worker acts within a context. So the social worker actively does things in order to bring the strengths to light and to utilize the strengths of the system that you're working with. And that the social worker works with the client system to move towards normalizing and capitalizing on the person's strengths. So that can be part of that process can be identifying those strengths along with the client system and utilizing them and in terms of as a resource for intervention. Central ideas behind the strengths perspective are that many people are able to function relatively well in spite of the difficulties they face and the resources they can't or don't access. And we can all think about even our own lives in terms of that. Things where maybe are challenges to us or things in our past that were challenges to us and that we actually were able to cope and function. And in many ways, some of those challenges can actually end up being our assets. The idea that people are resilient and possess skills, ideas, and determinations that need to be considered when developing intervention. And also the idea that change happens when social workers collaborate with clients' aspirations, perceptions, and strengths. So when we work in collaboration with our clients, utilizing their strengths, we have much more better outcomes or much more positive outcomes than we do when operating from an expert kind of point of view in terms of intervention. Focus of strengths-based intervention are that clients are the expert of their own situation and solutions to problems. And we're going to, later on in this PowerPoint, I'll talk a little bit about, though, how I think sometimes that can be misinterpreted and not used to the greatest asset for our clients. The idea that interventions should begin with where the clients are. So that idea that you might be able to see a client's strengths and where they might be able to end up, but you're going to start where they're at. You're going to utilize clients' assets, assess strengths in the intervention, and that you're going to recognize and work with individuals and environmental barriers that might hinder these interventions. Social workers can assess several different areas to help guide your intervention. So as a social worker, you're going to assess the following areas when you're going to be kind of making a plan of action in terms of interventions. You're going to assess the environmental resources and strengths, both naturally and non-naturally occurring resources. You're going to assess the environmental deficits or obstacles. You're going to assess personal resources and strengths, and you're also going to assess personal deficits or obstacles. So in this way, utilizing the strengths-based in both the macro and micro areas. So let's look at an example of doing so in terms of assessing environmental resources and strengths. So, for example, you might find that a family has strong family ties and relationships. So your intervention would look at utilizing those natural strengths and supports that are already there. So you might help enlist of a parent maybe to provide transportation for your client to job interviews. You might enlist another family member in terms of supporting that person. You're going to assess the community resources. So in this example, if a client agrees to enroll in job training workshop at the local community center, you're going to utilize that resource that's already available. And then assessment, strong community ties and network. An example of that intervention would be that client agrees to call friends, previous coworkers, church contacts, or other supports to ask about job leads. Moving through these next couple of slides, you can read them on your own. We talk about the assessment piece and then what the intervention would look like. Next, in terms of assessing personal resources and strength, maybe your assessment finds that the client has strong problem-solving skills, and so the intervention might look like that you're going to foster the client's use of these skills to help identify current employment issues and develop a plan to overcome obstacles or to explore successful strategies that the client has used in the past to solve problems. That's a great use of the strengths perspective in terms of intervention, is to ask clients, well, what have you done in the past that actually worked? Let's look at personal deficits or obstacles. So maybe a client feels overwhelmed and is discouraged easily. So in terms of intervention, you might utilize the use of identifying small, doable steps that are easily accomplished that will work up to larger goals. And why I like this this example is that I think oftentimes inexperienced social workers or social workers can misunderstand the focus of strengths intervention in terms of let's meet the client where they are, or the client is their best expert. And while those things are true, your job as a social worker in terms of utilizing the strengths-based intervention is to be a facilitator in helping the client access those strengths and optimize those strengths. So I want to talk about that in terms of strengths perspective and practice. And the idea that the strengths perspective does not mean that you only talk about the positive and you don't acknowledge the truth about the challenge of what is bringing the person into the need for intervention. So operating from the strengths perspective, while you definitely utilize and identify strengths, you're also, as a social worker, you're real with them, you're honest, and you're transparent about what's happening. The other thing that's important in strengths perspective is that you're always holding on to hope. And in terms of always holding on to hope, that also means that you're not going to be predicting outcome. And I think as social workers become more and more experienced, that's often a trap that we can fall into, that we've worked with people so many times in so many situations that we can often make judgments or have preconceived notions about who or who won't be successful. And one of the greatest, I think, gifts that strengths perspective has given to me as a social worker in terms of practice is that idea that I can never predict outcome, that I can be working with a family and think, oh, given this set of circumstances and given, my prior history with working with families like this, I can predict what their outcome will be. But working from the strengths perspective framework, you are always going to hold on to hope, and you're never going to make those predictions, because let me tell you, oftentimes those predictions are not accurate, whether or not they're, in the more kind of positive vein or in a more challenged vein. The other thing about the strengths perspective is that it forces you as a social worker to be highly creative. You kind of have to have a really quick mind and smart mind in terms of, looking at systems and resources and accessing them and utilizing them to your client's benefit. So thank you for listening to my brief lecture this week. As always, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or concerns or you need clarification on anything. Have a great week.